In the last 100 years, sport has enriched our lives and brought pleasure to countless millions. The great spectacles of sport have become global festivals. Sporting events generate the biggest television audiences. Athletes have become superstars in a billion-dollar industry. Sport is played with a passion that moves nations. It can unite the world in harmonious goodwill, but it can divide people with a viciousness that defies reason. In 1900, the sporting arena was very different. Few events were well organized, professionals were rare, and no competitions came close to global support. Sport was still a quaint diversion from the serious business of life. The first hints of what was to become of sport appeared in France at the beginning of the century. Baron Pierre de Coubertin's dream to revive the ancient Olympic Games had already been realized in Athens in 1896. The Games of the Second Modern Olympiad were organized as part of the World Exhibition in Paris in 1900. But the Games were chaotic, no more than a sideshow to the main event. It would be several years before the Olympic Games acquired their modern mantle of importance. Technology gave the clearest hint of what was to become of sport. The bicycle was a 19th century invention. It led to a leisure revolution. It also spawned the new sport of cycling. In France and Belgium, it became highly organized and professional. It soon spread to Italy, Spain, and Holland. The Tour de France began in 1903 and became one of the great occasions on the sporting calendar. Today, an annual audience of 20 million spectators lines the routes as the riders are tortured in one of the world's toughest endurance events. Throughout the century, the most famous winners have become national heroes. Fausto Coppi of Italy, Jacques Anquetil of France, Eddy Merckx of Belgium, and Spain's Miguel Indurain. Even more elaborate technology, yet more dedicated professionalism, and much more money drove sport on four wheels. Road races, or trials for motor cars, had been held in France since 1894. But in 1906, the first French Grand Prix was held. Georges Boileau, Paolo Zuccarelli, and Jules Gou became the first motor racing legends. Brooklands was opened in 1907, and the Brickyard, the Indianapolis Speedway, in 1909. The sport of motor racing produced many heroic figures, from Nuvolare to Senna, and from A.J. Foyt to Al Unser. It became the world's most glamorous sport. But the most revered champion of 20th century motor racing was Argentinian Juan Manuel Fangio. A man of great charm and dignity, he endeared himself to sports fans way beyond motorsport and became an international celebrity. He won 5 Formula One World Championships in 1951 and 4 times in succession from 1954. Just as cycling and motor racing illustrated the impact that professionalism would have on 20th century sport, other sports began to exhibit the significance that would come from international competition. The Davis Cup in tennis was inaugurated in 1900 between Britain and the United States, and has ever since brought the added spice of international rivalry to the personal duel across the net. France and Belgium entered the competition in 1904. Others quickly followed. Throughout the ensuing decades, several periods of dominance occurred, none more remarkable than that enjoyed by France's 4 musketeers, Jean Barotre, Jacques Brugnon, Henri Cochet, and René Lacoste brought France 6 consecutive Davis Cup titles between 1927 and 1932. The presence of their vivacious and equally dominant compatriot Suzanne Lenglen in the same era brought France a marvelous age of tennis. It was much the same in Australia after the Second World War. Under the shrewd guidance of Harry Hopman, men like Sedgman, Hode, Rosewall, Emerson and Lever won the Davis Cup 15 times between 1950 and 1967. But tennis wasn't Australia's greatest sporting passion. That privilege belonged to the most English of all British sporting exports, cricket. Australia had been challenging England at cricket long before the century began. When Jack Hobbs, the great English batsman, began his final test series in Australia in 1928, he was run out in the first test by a 20-year-old Australian prodigy who would become the most revered cricketer of them all. Don Bradman was the boy from Bowral, New South Wales, who became Sir Donald George Bradman, Australia's most famous son. When the Don was batting, cricket grounds filled. When he was out, they went home contented, for it was usually at the end of a long summer's day of classical strokes. The most significant testament to his prowess are the statistics of his batting. Very good international players average about 50 runs per innings. A few exceptional players have averaged just over 60. Bradman's average was 99.94. He became such a threat to England's desire to beat their arch rivals that in 1932, the English tourists adopted a bowling tactic called leg theory. Australians called it bodyline and, more importantly, ungentlemanly. The bowling was aimed at the Australians' legs and body to stop them scoring. It worked, but cricket was never the same again. Sport was becoming too important to be governed by the simple values of sportsmanship and fair play. The intervention of the United States in the final stages of the First World War had been crucial to its outcome. America was the new powerhouse in world affairs. So it was in sport. But the post-war years had an inauspicious start in American sport. Baseball, the national pastime, was shaken to its foundations by a huge scandal. It emerged in 1920 that 8 members of the Chicago White Sox had conspired to throw the 1919 World Series against the Cincinnati Reds. The idolized shoeless Joe Jackson was part of the conspiracy. They were banned for life to become the stuff of legends. The game was in a lamentable state, desperate for reform and new heroes. The sporting fates quickly obliged. He had many nicknames: the Sultan of SWAT, the Bambino, but he'll always be known as the Babe. George Herman Ruth changed the face of baseball and sport in America. Even in parts of the world where baseball is little known or understood, Babe Ruth is acknowledged as an almost mythical hero. Ruth was a man of his era, bold, brash, and controversial. His appetite for the game was matched by his appetites for food, drink, women, and adulation. The fans loved him, partly because of his persona, but mainly because of his talent. The New York Yankees became the dominant force in the game. They built a dynasty around him, including the Iron Horse Lou Gehrig, and even a new Yankee Stadium. 1927 was the pinnacle. With Ruth at the forefront, baseball's finest ever team dominated the season. The Babe hit 60 home runs, a record that would survive for over 30 years. The renewal of America's love affair with baseball was reflected in its growing passion for another, far less subtle game. College football and its massive new stadia spread outwards across America. The most prodigious example were known as the Fighting Irish, the students of Notre Dame in Indiana. Ronald Reagan starred in a film about their exploits. They did it for the Gipper. They did it for Newt Rockne, a Norwegian immigrant who became one of the most famous coaches in American sport. As crowds grew, the significance of the media grew. Newspapers, radio, and cinema newsreel fed audience demand. The demand for sport and entertainment produced the fuel that made the dream machine work: money. It was billed as the battle of the century. Perhaps it should have been called the shape of things to come, for all the ingredients of the drama of 20th century sport were there. Jack Dempsey was a fighter, a ferocious puncher who loved a brawl. He had pummeled reigning champion Jess Willard into submission in 1919. In 1921, he found the ideal opponent. Georges Carpentier was never more than a light heavyweight, but he was a supreme boxer. A handsome, urbane French war hero, it was the perfect match. The contest took place in Jersey City in front of 90,000 people, the biggest crowd in boxing history. A temporary wooden arena was built to stage the fight. It was the first title fight to be broadcast on radio and the first $1 million gate. And the slugger beat the boxer. The gallant Frenchman was no match for the ferocious American. Another legend was christened. The Manasseh Mauler went on to transform boxing just as Babe Ruth transformed baseball. The tremendous 20s roared on in American sport. In golf, there were three heroes who would propel the game into the modern era. Walter Hagen was so at ease with the game and with himself that during a social round he said to Britain's Prince of Wales, who was soon to become King Edward VIII, "Eddie, hold the flag, will you?" In more serious competition, he won 11 major championships. Gene Sarazen was born Saraceni, the son of Italian immigrants, the second of a trio of Americans who turned golf from a quintessentially British affair into an all-American one. Perhaps the most prodigious of the three was Bobby Jones. He played only 52 tournaments, amateur or professional, in his entire career, and won 23 of them. His two greatest legacies will always be crucial to the history of golf. In 1930, he crowned his career with the impossible quadrilateral: the US and British amateur titles, and the US and British Opens, all in the same year. And in 1934, he played at an invitational tournament on a new course he had designed himself, near to his birthplace in Atlanta, Georgia. The course was called the Augusta National. The tournament became known as the Masters. Modern tennis was given its shape in the 1920s by an American who many still regard as the game's greatest player, William Tatum Tilden II. Big Bill was a compelling personality whose game encompassed a booming service and a full array of virtuoso shots. His artistry had a strong theatrical streak. It endeared him to many, but scandalized others. His homosexuality and his ego weren't often appreciated among the more conservative sectors of sport and society. But the 20s was an era of change. Tilden led the United States to 7 Davis Cup titles during the decade and collected a personal haul of 3 Wimbledon titles and 7 US Open championships. As the Roaring 20s drew to a close, America had stamped its indelible mark on the history of 20th century sport as it enjoyed its golden age. Fittingly, the preparations were already underway for the world's greatest sporting spectacle to be held in Tinseltown. In 1932, the Olympic Games were scheduled to take place in Los Angeles. Americans started to dominate the modern Olympic Games from their inception in Athens in 1896. Although European, aristocratic in origin, the philosophy of Olympic sport was a perfect fit for the brash young country. Idealistic, meritocratic, and competitive. The Los Angeles Games were a huge success, despite the pervasive gloom of the Great Depression. Sport offered a vehicle for optimism, a relief from drudgery. But an even more ominous gloom than economic depression was threatening sport. Its mass appeal was too attractive for those whose ambitions lay beyond the sporting arena. The symbolism and passion of sport made ideal weapons of propaganda. Both the Winter Games in Garmisch-Partenkirchen and the Summer Games in Berlin in 1936 were festooned with Nazi imagery. Sport and the Olympic movement did little to resist the manipulation. A few athletes rose above the hypocrisy. Some refused to make Nazi salutes, and many German athletes resisted the encouragement to regard their fellow competitors as inferior. Lutz Long, the blonde, blue-eyed German silver medalist in the long jump, formed a lifetime friendship with the man who beat him and who embodied sport's answer to Hitler's propaganda. Jesse Owens was the son of an Alabama sharecropper. In Berlin, he became a 20th century hero. A year before the Games, he had broken 6 world records in an afternoon. In Berlin, he won 4 gold medals and captivated the German public. Owens and his fellow black Americans had triumphed, even in the cauldron of Hitler's prejudice. But it was a hard road to glory for black athletes in America. Jack Johnson had become the first black athlete of international stature when he won the world heavyweight title from Tommy Burns in 1908. He had to chase him around the world to Sydney before Burns had finally agreed to the fight. Up to that point, white champions had resolutely refused to accept a challenge from a black boxer. Johnson won easily. His reign was tumultuous. He was one of the greatest of all heavyweights, but his exuberant individuality meant that he would never be a docile black champion. His victories caused race riots in America. His dalliances with white women fueled a public animosity that demanded a great white hope be found to teach him a lesson. But no one was good enough to do it until Johnson was 37 years old. Jess Willard, a 6'6" giant, finally subdued him after 26 rounds in the debilitating heat of Havana, Cuba. In 1920, he was jailed in Fort Leavenworth, Kansas, for acts of immorality with a white woman. When he was released, his life drifted into obscurity. It would be nearly 30 years before the color bar was finally broken in American sport. The Olympic Games of 1936 were not the first occasion that fascist demagogues had used sport for overtly political purposes. That dubious honor already belonged to Benito Mussolini. His chosen sport was Italy's and the world's most popular game, football. The people's game is one of the many sporting codes that Britain has bequeathed to international competition. Although the new rules of association football had taken a firm root in England and Scotland by the 1880s, most European and South American teams weren't founded until the last decade of the 19th century. But the game spread at an astonishing speed, especially in South America. Uruguay claimed the title as the world's first outstanding team outside the British Isles by winning the Olympic tournament in 1924 and 1928. They then brought reality to the dreams of Frenchmen Jules Rimet and Henri Delaunay by organizing the first World Cup in 1930. A country of barely 2 million people built a magnificent stadium worthy of the occasion. 90,000 people packed themselves into the Estadio Centenario in Montevideo to see Uruguay beat Argentina 4-2 in the final. A national holiday was declared in Uruguay. In Argentina, disgruntled fans stormed the Uruguayan embassy. Riot police had to open fire to disperse the crowds. The intense excitement of international competition exposed the dangerous seduction of sport. So sweet is the taste of victory, any price is worth paying in order to savor it. Mussolini's Italy had offered to subsidize the entire World Cup tournament in 1934, but the propaganda value would only work if they won. In Vittorio Pozzo, they had a tactical genius as a coach, and in Giuseppe Meazza, a player of great quality. Playing under the threatening banner of fascism, they duly won. They repeated the feat in France 4 years later in 1938. But much more dangerous seductions of victory were wreaking havoc by then. Italy had already invaded Abyssinia, and Spain was in the midst of civil war. The German team was littered with Austrians, whose country had been annexed only 3 months previously. The playing fields of the world would be deserted for many years, whilst once again its killing fields became littered with the dead of World War. The pervasive horror of the Second World War laid waste to much of Europe, Japan, and the Far East. In many countries, sport was changed fundamentally as new regimes used it as a symbol of political ideology. In Eastern Europe, the spread of communism from the Soviet Union encouraged governments to invest in sport on an unprecedented scale. For the next 50 years, the anthems of state-funded socialist sport echoed around the arenas of the world. The 1954 World Cup was expected to be the crowning moment for the world's greatest football team. Hungary had joined Austria and Italy as Europe's best teams before the Second World War. The communist takeover merely added the power of the state to an already blossoming game. They won the Olympic tournament in 1952, scoring 20 goals in only 5 games. In 1953, they traveled to England and at Wembley Stadium gave the country that invented the game a lesson in football. They scored 6 times. The following year, they scored 7 more in Budapest. They were called the Golden Team. They lost only once in their 6-year reign. Unfortunately, the defeat came in the World Cup final in Bern in 1954. Despite the great skills of Ferenc Puskás and his team, Hungary lost 3-2 to West Germany after dominating the tournament. They were gracious in defeat. 2 years later, they suffered a much greater loss. The Hungarian uprising of 1956 was crushed by Soviet tanks. The Golden Team never played again. New football dynasties soon replaced the Hungarians. Germany continued to be a major force in world football, with 2 more world championships. England, the cradle of world football, finally became world champions with an historic victory in 1966. Italy added a 3rd world championship to those of the 1930s in Spain in 1982. And Argentina repeated Uruguay's South American World Cup double in 1978 and 1986. The World Cup itself achieved a unique sporting status, as it became a pilgrimage for the world's greatest players and their armies of delirious fans. Of all the countries obsessed with football, none bears comparison with Brazil. The Maracanã, Rio's huge stadium, is treated like a cathedral. The country has produced many talented players, but among them is the greatest footballer the world has ever seen, Edson Arantes do Nascimento, Pelé. He dominated his first World Cup in Sweden in 1958 at the age of 17. He scored over 1,000 goals in his career and achieved the near impossible by becoming a household name in America as a soccer player. Brazil won the World Cup 4 times from 1958 onwards. But their finest hour, inspired by Pelé, came in Mexico in 1970. They gave a series of virtuoso performances which the world of football will never forget. It was a glorious era of Brazilian success. It was also an era of fundamental change in sport. Throughout the 60s and 70s, sport underwent a commercial revolution that changed it irrevocably. In 1958, the Brooklyn Dodgers uprooted themselves and went to play ball in the more lucrative market of Los Angeles. Sports Illustrated said, sport had lost its innocence forever. The 1960 Olympic Games in Rome were the first to be broadcast to a worldwide audience. Sport, money, and television were colliding to create a new global industry. Golf and then tennis were in the vanguard of the sporting revolution, as television first attracted the audience, then the sponsor, and finally led the players to realize their value and demand their slice of the action. Sport has always been a vehicle of opportunity. Jackie Robinson broke the color bar in baseball in 1947. Suddenly, worlds of opportunity denied to so many became fields of dreams for all. Joe Louis had already reopened the door of opportunity which had been slammed in the face of Jack Johnson. In 1938, he beat Germany's Max Schmeling to regain the world heavyweight title he had won from American James J. Braddock in 1937. Although Louis was succeeded by the awesome Rocky Marciano, boxing became dominated by black Americans. A black American boxer was probably the most charismatic figure in the history of sport and one of the 20th century's great personalities. The story of Cassius Marcellus Clay became a story of our times.
I am the greatest.
His talent was so immense and his personality so charismatic that he transcended sport.
You know how great I am. I don't have to tell you about my strategy. I tell my trainer, say, Bodina, come here. Bodina, tell him, what are we going to do? We're going to float like a butterfly and sting like a bee.
In 1960, he won a light heavyweight gold medal at the Olympic Games in Rome. Even then, the speed and agility that no one thought possible in a future heavyweight were plain to see. Nearly 40 years later, he lit the flame at the Centennial Olympic Games in Atlanta. In between, Muhammad Ali had thrown away his Olympic gold medal in disgust at his treatment as a black American, won the world title 3 times, changed his religion, changed his name, taken on the American government over the Vietnam War, and become a symbol of hope for millions of young athletes all over the world. In Atlanta, he was given a new Olympic gold medal. In 1956, at the Olympic Games in Melbourne, only 72 countries sent teams, and only 25 of them won gold medals.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the opening ceremony of the Games of the 26th Olympiad, the Centennial Olympic Games.
But in 1996 in Atlanta, 197 countries participated in the Games, and the winners' medals were shared between 53 countries. In the closing decades of the century, sport had become a truly global phenomenon, the festival of culture that de Coubertin always hoped it would be.
We may be able to sit down together at the table of brotherhood. I have a dream.
Although the Olympic Games enjoyed an era of unprecedented success at the end of the century, there had been many difficult moments in the preceding decades. By the 1960s, sport had become so significant in international consciousness that it became embroiled in global politics and ultimately violence. Hundreds of innocent students were killed at a rally before the 1968 Games in Mexico. During the Games, black Americans chose the winner's podium to protest at the treatment of their contemporaries back home in America. In 1972, the sanctity of the athletes' village in Munich was violated by terrorists. 17 people were killed as the tragedy unfolded on worldwide television. There was an African boycott of the Montreal Games in 1976 in protest at sporting links with the apartheid-based regime in South Africa. And in 1980, the United States led a major boycott of the Moscow Olympics in opposition to the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. By 1984, the Olympic Games were financially and morally bankrupt. Only Los Angeles made a bid to host the Games. There was yet another political confrontation as the Soviet Union led a retaliatory boycott following the American absence in Moscow. But the Games survived. The International Olympic Committee chose to embrace the sporting revolution, a revolution in commercial pragmatism and shrewd diplomacy.
The city will have the honor and responsibility to organize the Olympic Games of the year 2004 is Athens.
The amateur tradition was consigned to history. The leaders of sport became politicians. Television was welcomed like a long-lost friend. Commercial sponsors became honored guests at sporting feasts.
Mesdames et messieurs,
The Olympic Games and other great sporting events were rendered financially secure. Political interference was reduced dramatically. Sport gained authority and independence. But the transformation in the affairs of international sport was not without its critics. Many regretted the passing of the amateur ideal. They felt that television and money were corrupting the purity of sporting competition. They argued that rather than saving sport, commercial and political expediency had destroyed it forever. Indeed, contemporary sport, amidst its overt success, is beset by problems. Some are of its own doing. Many are reflections of the problems of our times. The will to win, especially when the rewards are so great, burns so brightly in the hearts of many, it leads them to cheat. Performance-enhancing drugs have been a problem from the beginning of the century.
I don't care what happened afterwards. If you could beat me 1,000 times, I don't care. As long as I win the gold medal, and that's a miracle to win.
Throughout the years, the sophistication of modern medicine has exacerbated the problem. It remains as an invidious cancer within the body of sport. Sport only has moral virtue if its ideals of fair play and honest competition are respected. The unacceptable face of winning and the inability to lose graciously threaten the idealism of sport. Sport has traveled a long way in the 20th century. In many ways, it has been a mirror of the century. It has reflected the dreams of children and the nightmares of demagogues. It has shown us at our best and at our worst. But it has been one of the 20th century's enduring sources of pleasure for countless millions. Its heroes have enriched our lives. The challenge for sport in the next century is to ensure that its values and the joy of its performance are not undermined by its own success.